All right, so George is not here this evening. She is off doing her thing, but it looks like she's going to try to keep me in line via DM. So we'll see how well she does. But this week, ISO 3533 standard was released by the International Organization of Standards. And I don't know why it's ISO versus iOS, but I don't know. They're European, so they do things a little bit weird. Ooh, wait, she has control of the restream. Oh no. So ISO 3533 came out this week, and I wanted to take a few minutes to go over it. I think there's some interesting stuff in here. I think it has some interesting implications for the industry, but I don't really know just how much it's going to change things. We're going to go to display share, and then I'm going to bring up the PDF. And here we go. ISO 3533 International Standard Sex Toys Design and Safety Requirements for Products in Direct Contact with Genitalia, the Anus, or both. And then the same thing down in French because they're international. So just kind of proof of life thing that I actually do have the document. And I wish I could show the entire thing, but I can't. It's copyrighted. And so I am forbidden from showing the entire thing. Now, I can talk about the contents of it, and for the $100 that I spent on this, it's you're damn right I'm going to. I'm going to get some value out of this. And by the way, if you haven't heard before, we do have a website that is www.amavidi.com, where you can find all of our toys and such. But generally speaking, it's a fairly short document. It is all of 24 pages long, and the first 3, 4, 5 pages are content, like an index and a foreword. Page 6 is an introduction, and it talks about how sex toys are produced, marketed, and sold in most countries in the world. And then basically that these products are in touch with sensitive parts of, and should therefore we should at least be paying attention to the materials and things like that. Also, it can be very embarrassing, they say, for people to have problems that require a doctor to address, which we'll come back to that. And the idea is that the international standard for sex toys would help both users, producers, and resellers to make sure the sex toys on the market are safe to use and the user has enough information on how to use them correctly. This document ensures blah, 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 blah. Stuff. Doesn't really matter. This page intentionally left blank. Great, I paid for a blank page. Now, the scope of it is that they are specifically talking about and materials and design that are manufactured for sexual use. And so, they're fairly narrowly focused on the topic. And I think it's interesting. I think there's an interesting question here that really we're going to be curious to see how it plays out, is that one of the things that allows indie toy makers and allows manufacturers in general to produce the toys that they do without any supervision or certification or any kind of review by the FDA is that they are technically for novelty use. They're not designed to be a medical product. And so, there's always been this divide between it's not a medical product and it's a novelty. Now, by specifically labeling yourself, and let's say you take on this ISO standard, ISO 3533, and you want to be compliant with it. Well, now, are you still a novelty? And if you're not a novelty, are you a medical device? And that's an interesting gray area for me. I think there's room there that if you don't say you're a medical device, then you're not a medical device. And so it's not under the FDA. But we're taking a step away from that novelty classification. And they do say this document is not primarily intended for products classified as medical devices, cosmetic, or assistive products, for example, lubricants, massage oils, etc. And yeah. Now they go through and define certain things like what a sex toy is, what the term intended use is, risk, manufacturer, sharp edge. I think this is an interesting one. Accessible edge of a toy, which represents unreasonable risk of injury during intended use, and reasonable foreseeable misuse. So we're still in the part where they're making their definitions. Moonlight Toys, hey, how you doing? Glad to see you. Definitely drop in if you've got any questions. Be happy to answer them. So, accessible edge of a sex toy, which represents a unreasonable risk of injury. So again, like I said, we're still in the definitions term. We're still trying to get our hands around what are the terms that they are focusing on. And then foreseeable use and reasonably foreseeable use. So these are kind of categories of, how would you, what's the reason, if there was a random human being, how could you see them screwing this up? How could you see them misusing this? And also, how do you expect people to use it? That is something that is of note here. Now, I should also mention that the ISO standards are voluntary. They are not mandated in any way. And to a certain extent, there are only certain ISO standards that are actually certifiable. And, you probably heard ISO 9001. That's a fairly common one. But, there's a certification process to get ISO 9001 certified. Well, not all of the ISO standards have certification processes. And I don't know that this is one of them. I believe this is going to be one of those ISO standards that is not certified yet. They may revise it in the next couple of years to try to include some kind of a certification process. But at this point, it's not mandatory. It's not enforceable. There's not even any sort of mechanism for checking in to see if somebody actually is ISO 3533 compliant. So yeah. Anyway, then there is a nice long section 4, about risk analysis. And this is where, this is a little bit theoretical, and this is a little bit about, reviewing the product and what are the risks in terms of, size or shape, or they also have something in here about electronics. So if you have any kind of a vibrator, or if you have any kind of heating element in it, or materials, if there are certain materials that could be a risk, if you've got actually some of the Enjoy toys, and I'll spell that out because it's a little bit weird. Enjoy, they do metal toys, and those things weigh a bit of weight. A couple of pounds is not unlikely for their toys. So if you have a metal toy that weighs a couple of pounds, then there's a risk of somebody dropping it on their foot. So some of it is reasonable, some of it is just what are the risks? And part of the ISO standard is that they want you to identify the risks and how those risks can be mitigated, and also a review process for identifying any new or uncovered risks. So then they have a risk analysis process, which includes a risk assessment, post-market control. Basically, the post-market control is one where they want you to have ongoing testing and ongoing review of your processes. And if there is a reason to, then you should have a way of recalling those toys as necessary. And it can be done by customer feedback. Data can also be used to further improve products, etc., etc., etc. Okay, now design requirements. This is kind of where we start to get into the meat of it a little bit, and we are now 9 pages into it. So we have the design requirements. General design requirements are that you should understand the intended use, and that the design process should take into account the intended use, the materials, and also a risk assessment of the reasonably foreseeable misuse. And that includes the packaging and user information. So the next category, they start getting into the anal use products. And the big thing that they seem to be focused on here is shall be designed so that the risk of retaining the product in the anal canal or rectum is minimized. So basically put a flared base on it and put enough of a difference between the neck and the base that you're not going to have any problems with it getting sucked up inside the body. They do have a separate appendix at the end for specific guidance about things, and we'll come back to that in a bit. The other thing I think is interesting about this category, or this section right here, is that they have a comment here, a recommendation regarding if it is to be inserted into the anus, then you should be considering and thinking about ways of retrieving that object safely. And basically, if something gets sucked up into the body, you should be considering how do you design a toy such that it is easier to retrieve. And they do have some topics a little bit farther along, but in the loosest sense, if you had a ring at the bottom of it, a loop or something that a doctor could get a hold of in order to pull that back out, that is kind of the category, that's the kind of area that they want you to be thinking about, so that you don't make it more difficult for the doctors in the end if that does happen. And they talk about a common problem with something that needs to be extracted is that it can't be grasped by fingers or instruments. And so they want you to be considering that scenario. And then we go into mechanical hazards, prevention of retention. Now, technically, I think you can see, even if you haven't bought the document, you can see the outline of it. And so if you want to, you can look it up and look at the outline and follow along with me. Prevention of retention. And this is a little bit more general in terms of both vaginal and anal use. But they also do call out the rectum and the urethra, which is if you are into, or if one of your products is designed for sounding, then you should be thinking about, and your design should take into account, what happens if how do you keep that sound from being retained or being lost inside the body? Now, I missed that when I first read it. I didn't realize that they got into urethral sounding as well. Now, I need to catch up on myself here because I want to make sure that I get this right. So they should be, again, this is kind of, it's interesting that they are very generally kind of just massaging around some of these ideas. They're not telling you what shape it has to be or what size it has to be. There are some comments towards the end in the appendix about sizing for anal toys and things like that. And specific considerations that should be given at certain sizes. Let's see. Oh, products for genital enclosure. We're talking about cock rings, penile rigidity rings, as they call them, chastity devices, shall be safely removable by the user. And that I'm kind of trying to keep myself from just directly quoting and reading all of this because, well, again, it's copyrighted, but I can give my review of it. I can give my comments about it. They also want you to, if you're going to be using some kind of a chastity device, they want it so that it can be removed with general household equipment such as pliers or something like that. If you have moving or removable parts, now that's an interesting category where we're talking about sex machines that have replaceable dildos, battery compartments, etc. You should have a locking mechanism that makes sure that everything stays in place. Then there's a section about vibration, and then they actually reference another ISO standard about the effects of vibration. But you should basically make sure that you don't over vibrate, because there's some nerve damage that can happen there. And oh, that's interesting. Products that are powered by an electrical cord, so not a battery operated device, should have a timer on them, and you should clearly state the maximum time. Let's see. Who was that? I've forgotten your name. T23LC. Who was that? I've forgotten. Moonlight Toys. Gotcha. Moonlight Toys. Your comment about size is a personal choice. That's individual. You're absolutely correct. And when we talk about size here in a few minutes, there are certain categories that, by their determination of the average human body, that these, once you exceed these particular dimensions, then you are prone to having issues. So we'll come back to that in a minute, because that's in the appendix. But if you are powered by a power cord, not a battery operated device, you need to have a timer on it, and you should explicitly say how long that timer is, which is interesting. How many vibrators do you know of that plug in that actually have a timer on them? I mean, the Hitachi Magic Wand, I mean, that thing is, I mean, it's a freaking motorcycle almost. There's no timer on that. So yeah, that's interesting. And then surface temperatures. If you have a product that is designed to heat up, there are limits as to how hot that product can get. You have one. What do you have? What is that? Boy, I keep wanting to call you somebody else. That's what my problem is. It's Moonlight, right? I have to go back and check, make sure. Moonlight, yes. I keep wanting to call you Twilight something. Moonlight. Okay. But there are limits to the actual temperatures that you can have on a product that gets warm. And those are specifically called out, that they're the temperature thresholds that can cause burns. And okay. Now we're getting into, there's a comment here about products should be both smooth and free from burrs and sharp edges. That's common sense, but anyway. Now we get into the materials, and this is kind of where I wanted to really dive in on this document for myself, was how do they identify products or how do you identify materials that should or shouldn't be used? Now, they have a recommendation. Again, this is all voluntary, but they have a recommendation that you should have a restricted materials list or a restricted substance list. That includes limits of substances that should not be in your materials. And they do have some examples towards the end. Again, they just reference it. It's in the appendix. We'll come back to it. Biocompatibility, toys. Okay, here's where the rubber meets the road for me on materials. You should make sure that your materials are biocompatible, but how do you do that? And there's nothing in here specifically about determining biocompatibility, because then they reference another ISO standard, which is ISO 10993. Let me put that in the chat. ISO 10993. And they reference that as a standard by which you can determine biocompatibility. And they want you to ensure that you have biocompatibility. They don't necessarily tell you specifically what that means, and that they recommend that you contact your manufacturer to ensure ISO 10993 compatibility, compliancy. And yeah, you should also have documentation about cleaning and maintenance of the toys. Okay, there's some stuff in here about packaging, and because we're talking about intended use versus foreseeable reasonable misuse, they want you to call out what the intended use is for that toy. And yeah, they want you to do that on the packaging and identify any materials that may cause allergies or anything else. A lot of this is just so common sense to me. There's nothing really meaty in here for me yet. If you have batteries and charging equipment, you should be documenting all of that kind of stuff. You should be documenting cleaning instructions, disposal instructions, etc., etc. Okay, now then, let's get into that one category that everybody is pointing at. And the thing is that this is Appendix B for the butt. I do think that's hilarious because this whole section is about anal stuff. Appendix B. Okay, so when we talk about sizes, and there are some specific categories, they have small, medium, and large. And basically it's determined by the total length versus the diameter. And again, each one of those is in a category of small, medium, and large. So if you have something that is a medium in one of those dimensions, but a large in the other dimension, then it should be considered a large. Now, broadly speaking, and this is specifically to toys that will be used anally, and part of the reason that they specifically say that is because of the anatomy and the way that the colon, the rectum, and the anus are all positioned and relative to each other. Then you can create issues if your sizing is, let me rephrase that certain sizes are problematic in certain categories. And yes, I'm getting anal about things, but this is the category that I think is going to get misinterpreted the most by people who are just kind of glancing at the document. And even Moonlight was talking about size being a personal thing. Absolutely. But for the purposes of this document, they're talking about risk. And more specifically, a small product, a product that falls into the category of small, should be something that could be expelled with a bowel movement. That is basically what they're suggesting, is that something that should be considered small is something that if it does go in, that it could probably come out with a bowel movement. Now, something that is considered to be medium is something that if it were to be pulled into the body, then it would probably require assistance to be removed. And what that means is that they have a risk of entering the sigmoid colon from the rectum, and that they are of such dimension that they cannot be, that it's unlikely that they are going to be expelled by a bowel movement. So that is, and I guess should I tell you what those dimensions are? I'll tell you. I don't think I can get in trouble for that. Let's do it anyway. Okay, as far as length goes, less than 4 centimeters would be considered small. Then anything less than 12 centimeters would be considered medium, and anything over 12 centimeters would be considered large. So basically anything over about 4.5 inches would be considered large. Now that we're specifically talking about risk within this document. And this is their way of categorizing some of the diameter, 2.5 centimeters widest for small, less than 3.5 centimeters widest for medium, and anything over 3.5 centimeters at its widest for large. Medium-sized objects are usually too large to be passed naturally, but can be removed if possible to grasp. So if you could, it's one of those things that medium-sized object is one of those that you probably can't poop it out, but if you can get in there and work it around a little bit, you can probably pull it out yourself, or maybe with an assistant. You may not need to actually go to the doctor. The large ones, they classify those as objects that would require a certain amount of force or excessive amount of force in order to remove them. Okay, now I don't know how to, I'd love to read this whole thing or just show you the whole thing, because there's a discussion here about the shape of the rectum into the sigmoid colon, and how length of objects of a certain length that are rigid can change the shape of and the relationship of the rectum to the sigmoid colon. And that is something they specifically talk about in terms of making sure that if you have an object that does exceed 12 centimeters, that if it gets sucked up, that because of the shape of the rectum versus the colon, it is going to want to flip up to the side here. And I think that's actually a really interesting perspective to take on that. And these are not judgmental so much as these are terms, these are dimensions that are kind of generalized to the average human body. And then there's also a discussion of perforation, a risk of perforation, and safe maximal diameter should not exceed 3 to 3.5 centimeters. Basically, that anything over 3.5 centimeters is probably going to require some kind of anesthesia, whether it's local or general. And if it gets sucked too far up into the body, then they can't just go up through the rectum. They have to go through they have to do surgery, cut you open, remove it, and if there's any perforation, repair that as well. Yeah, there it is. Objects longer than 12 centimeters will risk pivoting the object from the position by the sacrum into the abdomen. And so that's where the risk comes in. And that's why they call it a large, is because of that dimension. It will want to flip up if it were sucked into the body. So if that were the case, you should also be thinking about how is a doctor or somebody going to retrieve this? And the materials that you use, something that is very hard, is going to be very difficult for somebody to get a hold of with forceps. And something that is very soft, that might tear, even if you put a loop on the end of it. So they want you to be considering the exit plan, so to speak. Okay. Appendix C, and this is the last appendix here. And there are some things in here that I'm actually really happy about. There's some things in here that I'm kind of like, well, duh. And this is specifically about a restricted substances list. And they have examples of restricted substance families. Now, remember, they haven't said what a recommended material is yet, other than it should be biocompatible. So, we're kind of in that category of just don't do this. They specifically call out phthalates. Let me type that because that is one of those that is easy to mispronounce. Yeah, we have fun at this. All my shit is large and even my small. Yeah. That's very possible. All right, so phthalates, organic tin compounds, which I think this is going to rule out your tin cured silicones. Then there are some other things, aromatic hydrocarbons, certain metals that can migrate, and they aren't specific about that. They do call them out a little bit later. Monomers that can migrate, such as formaldehyde, styrene, etc. Oh, don't use lead in your toys. Lead and cadmium, that's one of those things they specifically call out. Who has used lead in anything in the last 60 years? Let's see, alkyl phenols and azo dyes, nitrosatable substances, nitrous amines. So anyway, phthalates, lead and cadmium, organic tin compounds, those are kind of your big, and don't use formaldehyde. Those are your big items that they specifically call out. And again, this is an example of a restricted substances family. This isn't even them telling you can't. They just say, here's an example of something. Here's an example of what your restricted substances list might look like. But, they do have comments here about where they can be found and such. Oh boy. Okay, so I just hit you with a wall of information, and I was probably pretty messy about it. And then there's a bibliography that goes on about 3 pages, which is probably about as boring as this whole conversation could be. All right, so what are my thoughts? And while I do this, get your questions ready, drop them in the chat, send them by a DM, what have you. And I want to put just a little bit of context on this because I think the source of this document is interesting, because the original recommended document, originally submitted document that went into the committee for review, etc., came from WeVibe, which is a fairly big toy company. They're part of They're They're not part of Lovehoney. They're part of the Lovehoney group, which includes WowTech, Lovehoney, and WeVibe. So what I think is interesting is that you have kind of one of the big players in this category being involved in the process and development of the documentation. And so it's not coming from a group that is blind, in the sense that these are people who these are companies that are in the trenches, so to speak. So I think it's interesting that that's where it came from. I don't know how many changes were made to it since then, but we can probably assume that the Lovehoney group, WeVibe, Lovehoney, and WowTech are going to fall in line behind this. And if I remember correctly, Lovehoney is a distributor. And that means that Lovehoney might start requiring the products that they distribute to be ISO 3533 compliant, which then starts pushing the industry. And I think that's a really interesting possibility here, is that we could see the industry start to move in a way that is good for everybody. I don't see any problems with this document as is. I think that some of the misunderstandings, because there was a little bit of a hubbub about size and people complaining, well, you can't tell me what large is. Well, there was a little bit of a misunderstanding of why they use the categories of small, medium, and large. And those are basically risk profiles that have specific biological consequences. So I think this is a good document. It's not enforceable. It is completely voluntary. There's not a certification process for it yet. So, it exists. That's about all we can say at this point, is that it exists. And I think it's a good first draft. I think that it brings up some good information, and I think it forces people to think in certain ways.